Well, as you can see, the yard sale has started here at the church, and people are arriving and looking through all the items that have been brought in. And as I was thinking about the yard sale and what happens at all yard sales, the whole dynamic behind it is items that were once useful to someone at some point became no longer as useful, and they were willing to let go of it and let somebody else see if it could be useful to them. And hopefully they could make a little money in the process of selling the items. And it just helped me to think today about something for the devotion that I wanted to share with you, and that is sometimes in our lives when we feel like the items in a garage sale, we feel like maybe we were useful for a time at one point in time and we were good for something, but maybe through changes in our life or aging or change in circumstance, we feel like we're no longer able to do what we once were able to do, or maybe be as useful in some circumstances as we were in the past. And I just want to encourage you that just like the concept that's happening here today, there are those who are coming here to look at these items that have been discarded or donated and which became not as useful to some people. They still can be very useful to other people, and sometimes even in other applications as they're repurposed. And God has, through Christ, given us the opportunity to be repurposed in Him. There's two examples in the Bible of people who were not useful, or they became not useful in their previous role, but God later gave them an opportunity to become useful. One of those was an unbeliever. He was a slave, actually, that ran away, and his name was Onesimus. He had been useful to his master, his owner, but then he became unuseful, of course, when he ran away. But God had a plan for his life, and so Onesimus, or Oni as I've nicknamed him, Oni came across Paul, the Apostle Paul's path. Paul shared Christ with him. He accepted Christ, and he became very useful to Paul in his ministry for Christ. He was an example of God's grace. Later, he was restored to his previous owner, but the owner, who was a Christian, Paul instructed that he needed to give Oni his freedom, because that's what Christ would have him do. So you can read about that in a short book called Philemon. But the other person that I think about in the scripture that had been useful, even in ministry for God, but then became unuseful for a time, was John Mark. And he was a nephew of Barnabas, who was a person that God used in the early church to encourage the Apostle Paul and others in their ministry. And when the Apostle Paul was doing his first mission work, the first mission journey to carry the gospel from Jerusalem and to spread it to other regions, he took with him Barnabas, and they took John Mark, Barnabas's nephew, with them. Well, when they set sail, they arrived at the first city that they were going to begin doing their ministry, and John Mark, we don't know why, but John Mark turned back. He decided he didn't want to go with them. And so he went back home. This you can read about in Acts chapter 15. And I'm not going to read it to you now, but I just encourage you to look up that little bit of that story. But anyway, John Mark, when he returned back home, we didn't know whether he got homesick or he just felt like he wasn't up to it. But we can all relate to that in our lives. Sometimes we start out doing something for God, we get discouraged, or we feel like maybe we can't do it, and so we turn back. Well, this upset the Apostle Paul, and so in the future, when they were getting ready to go on another missionary journey, Barnabas said, well, let's take John Mark, let's give him another chance. And Paul said, no, he left us the first time, we're not going to risk it the second time. So Paul was a little bit unmerciful there in that situation. So Barnabas took John Mark, and they did go on a missionary journey, and the Apostle Paul took Silas, and they went a different way. God used that to spread the gospel. But here is the thing. Later on, after years of ministry, as the Apostle Paul was in prison now for his faith, and he needed someone to come to him, he had found a companion, a Christian companion and a fellow servant in Luke, the very person who wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. And the Apostle Paul, Luke records this, he was writing to Timothy, and actually we see this letter, and it's found in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11. And here's what the Apostle Paul writes to Timothy, who has now developed a relationship in the early church with a lot of these leaders. And apparently, Timothy had developed a relationship with John Mark. And so a lot of people knew that John Mark had become useful again in ministry, though for a while he was maybe discarded or considered not as useful. He had become useful again, and the Apostle Paul acknowledges this. And so here's the final thing that I want to share with you, the scripture for this evening, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11. The Apostle Paul, now as he is in prison, he has seen how John Mark over the years has become useful in ministry, and now the Apostle Paul, the very one who felt John Mark was not useful, has had a change of heart, and he says this to Timothy, "Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me in ministry." So this evening for the devotion, I just want to encourage you, if you're at a point in your life, either as a non-believer, and you feel like that you don't really have much to offer to God, and maybe that's one of the reasons you haven't come to Him, I don't know. But I want you to know that God considers you useful, and He wants you in His family. He loves you. He gave His life for you and rose again so that through faith in Him, you can be part of His forever family and be useful in His family to do His work on this earth, a work that is more important than the temporary things we're involved in now that's eternal. So you can be useful if you'll just give your heart and life to Christ and trust Him, because He's giving you spiritual gifts. He will give you spiritual gifts to use in His ministry. And then also, if you have accepted Christ, but for some reason you've gotten discouraged, you've turned away, or you've been hurt in the church, or by another believer, or whatever it is, and you feel like it's just kind of useless and you're not useful anymore, remember John Mark, because God showed John Mark through a relative, Barnabas, and through others, that he was still useful in ministry. And so just like these items here at the garage sale are going to be purchased, a price is paid to get them, though some might have considered them not as useful anymore, there are people that's willing to pay a price because these items will be useful to them. That's what God has done for all of us. He paid the price through His life, death, and resurrection, His precious blood. He rose again. He paid the price for us because He considers us useful for His ministry, and He wants to use us. So remember that. Onesimus and John Mark, two people who felt not as useful, but God said, yes, you're absolutely still useful. He paid the price for them. He's paid the price for you, and He wants you to be used for the work of His kingdom and to enjoy the fellowship of the family. God bless you.